In the waning days of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's life, as the 1870s turned into the early 1880s, he was aware that death was near, and he thought a lot about what it means to be an aging artist. He turned, as he considered these things, to an aging artist from the Italian Renaissance. This aging artist created works that we still care about today, that are still memorialized, that are still translated into many languages. And he wrote about this aging artist in his final work, Michelangelo. But this aging artist was not Michelangelo. Yes, Michelangelo is a character in his play Michelangelo, and it's interesting. If you look at the title, he separates the two words Michelangelo as two words instead of Michelangelo as one. But the artist he's most interested in Michelangelo, at least I think the artist he maybe most identifies with in this verse drama, is not the aging male artist, but his best friend. His best friend, at least his best friend who is a lady, is a woman named Vittoria Colonna. Now, Vittoria Colonna is now remembered as one of the greatest sonneteers of the Italian Renaissance. She's not as well known as Michelangelo, though some of Michelangelo's famous sonnets that are still translated and talked about are about Vittoria. Now, Vittoria was interesting. She was a contemporary of Michelangelo. She lived for many years in Rome, and she was famous for actually having a whirlwind romance with the Count of Pescara. Now, the Count of Pescara, she married him. They were very much in love, but Pescara was killed in battle and died relatively young. And so Colonna, a lot of her career as a mature artist was after her husband's death. And so she's remembered as a woman who was always kind of in mourning for her husband, even as she had these very powerful friends, marquises and cardinals and Michelangelo himself. There's always a mournful quality, usually to stories about Vittoria Colonna. And you can see in her sonnets in particular, this longing for being reunited with her husband. This is something that Michelangelo both loves and cares about in Vittoria Colonna in Longfellow's play, and something that I think Longfellow really identified with. Longfellow surely thought of Michelangelo as a man like him, an aging artist trying to make masterpieces, and yet Vittoria Colonna, in that she's the one who has lost and continues writing, is more like Longfellow himself. It probably deserves its own video, but one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is that Longfellow lost his second wife, Frances, in a freak accident in the early 1860s, just as the Civil War was breaking out. One afternoon, his wife was helping one of his children drip wax onto letters to make wax seals. Longfellow apparently was taking a nap in the adjacent room, and Frances was dripping hot wax from a candle. The hot wax fell onto her dress, and her dress went up in flames. Longfellow woke to hear her crying out for help. He smothered the flames in a rug, and himself was burned on his neck and face. Frances died from her burns. Longfellow was incapacitated for several weeks. In fact, his famous beard that he grew, which we mentioned earlier in a previous video, he grew to cover his scars. The scars to his emotions and his mental state lasted for the rest of his life, of course. He translated the Divine Comedy in the mid-1860s as partly, I think, a therapeutic gesture to try and figure out his own self, to go through the dark wood of his own grief. He comes out of that as a poet who has been through most things you can go through. He lost 2 wives now. He was a beloved father to his children till the day he died. And yet, like Vittoria Colonna, he carried around this feeling that his best relationship, his most treasured relationship, was gone to heaven, was gone to glory. And in this way, I think he identified with Dante too. But his picture of Vittoria Colonna isn't one of a ruined woman who is just waiting for death. It's of a woman who becomes a mentor and an ethical example to all those around her. The two people that Vittoria Colonna acts as an ethical example to in Michelangelo are a woman named Julia, who's sort of a younger, more worldly Roman noblewoman, and Michelangelo himself. I want to pick up where Julia and Vittoria are talking about Michelangelo and his recent amazing work in sculpture and painting. And Julia is teasing Vittoria because she knows that Vittoria is good friends with Michelangelo, and Julia kind of thinks that perhaps Michelangelo and Vittoria maybe are interested in each other as more than just friends. Julia says, "Your tame lion is Michelangelo." And Vittoria responds, "You speak a name that always thrills me with a noble sound, as of a trumpet. Michelangelo, a lion all men fear and none can tame, a man that all men honor and the model that all should follow, one who works and prays, for work is prayer, and he consecrates his life to the sublime ideal of art, till art and life are one, a man who holds such place in all men's thoughts, that when they speak of great things done, or to be done, his name is ever on their lips." So Vittoria praises Michelangelo very highly, and we see in the next scene that Michelangelo he's very taken with Vittoria. He sees her as he stands in a doorway, and he says, "How like a saint or goddess she appears, Diana or Madonna, which I know not, in attitude and aspect formed to be at once the artist's worship and despair." So Vittoria talks about Michelangelo as a man who both works and prays, and marries work and prayer together, a very important and difficult thing to do. Michelangelo, maybe like the man he is a little more conflicted. Maybe he's not as noble as Vittoria thinks him. Is she Diana? Is she Madonna? Is she this pagan goddess? Is she a Christian example? He's not sure. He wants to worship her. He wants to despair because of her beauty. Michelangelo has a perhaps less mature view of Vittoria than Vittoria has of him. And they have these scintillating conversations. This is where the real payoff of the Michelangelo verse drama is. They go back and forth, Michelangelo and Vittoria do, about the nature of art and building. Michelangelo says, to build, that is the noblest of all the arts. Painting and sculpture are but images, are merely shadows cast by outward things on stone or canvas, having in themselves no separate existence. Architecture, existing in itself, and not in seeming, a something that is not, surpasses them as substance shadow. Vittoria responds, "I understand you. Art is the gift of God, and must be used unto his glory. That in art is highest, which aims at this. When Saint Hilarion blessed the horses of Italicus, they won the race at Gaza, for his benediction o'erpowered all magic, and the people shouted that Christ has conquered Marnus. So that art, which bears the consecration and the seal of holiness upon it, will prevail over all others. Those few words of yours inspire me with new confidence to build. What think you? The old walls might serve, perhaps, some purpose still. The tower can hold the bells." So they're talking about this architecture project that Michelangelo is involved in, and they're inspiring each other back and forth. And it's interesting that Michelangelo is always a little less Christian than Vittoria is. Michelangelo is talking about the sublimity of art, particularly architecture. Vittoria kind of redirects Michelangelo's vision to, yes, in honor of God, this building is worthy. So Vittoria is acting as this kind of moral, ethical, theological guide, even as she's matching her peers in the Italian Renaissance as an artist. It's interesting. Julia really presses Vittoria as the play goes on, and like, why don't you and Michelangelo get together? You're both elderly, but this romance could blossom. And Vittoria says, I confess to something still more strange. Old as I am, I have at last consented to the entreaties and supplications of Michelangelo. And Julia says, to marry him? Vittoria responds, I pray, do not jest with me. You know, or you should know, that never such a thought entered my breast. I am already married. The Marquis of Pescara is my husband, and death has not divorced us. Julia says, pardon me, have I offended you? Vittoria responds, no, but have hurt me. Unto my buried lord I give myself, unto my friend the shadow of myself, my portrait. It is not from vanity, but for the love I bear him. So Vittoria's a little bit cagey here. She says, I've consented to Michelangelo. Julia jumps to, oh, you're going to marry him. No, he's going to paint my portrait. And yet we see in Vittoria this real commitment to, she really wants to be an artistic inspiration. I don't know if muse is quite the right word, but at least an artistic inspiration and goad to Michelangelo, but really has her boundaries clear. She's not going to marry him. Her love is still to Pescara in paradise. And this clear delineation of roles, you can be a passionate advocate of someone's art and encourage them and even sit for them, but keeping your boundaries clear, both ethically and romantically. It's something that Vittoria is very mature in, and Longfellow paints, I think, an important and unique picture of. Michelangelo, he paints her portrait, and it's sort of a very intimate scene where he paints her portrait. And Michelangelo has these beautiful monologues about it. You should read it for yourself. But Vittoria, after this, she goes away to a convent and becomes in poor health and ends up dying. And her final words are, call my confessor, not disobedient to the heavenly vision, Pescara, my Pescara. She wants a confessor. She wants to be given a final confession and last rites. She's calling out for her husband. But this line, it's an interesting variation on iambic pentameter, not disobedient to the heavenly vision. There's this sense that Vittoria Colonna is a woman of genius, of artistic talent, who can clash with the best of the Renaissance, but she is clear on what she is obedient to, and she's obedient to a heavenly vision. And this is where I think Longfellow closes out his career by giving us finally a very mature heroine. You know, Priscilla, Preciosa, Evangeline, these are Edith, Christison, these are all women who are relatively young. And yes, they have a heavenly vision often. Yes, they have this ability to meld their personal calling, their work in the world with the call to the ethical life. But I think that Vittoria Colonna shows us a mature, an older woman who is even more linguistically adept, even more ethically sure, and even more artistically brilliant than all of them, who is still living that life. And it's something that Longfellow gives to us in his writing about heroines. As he matures, his vision of heroines becomes more mature, and he finally gives us in Colonna this height of a picture of the truly mature artist, the truly mature lover who has lost her love, who is still committed to her love, and the truly mature Christian who has found a way to merge that theological call to godlikeness with a robust call to being a dedicated and honest artist. Thanks so much for joining us in these videos about Longfellow's heroines. Thanks so much for caring about Longfellow and taking this journey with us. If you're interested in reading about these heroines and other heroines who are more minor that we didn't have time to talk about in this video, you can check out my book, The Heroines of Henry Longfellow. Thanks for hanging out with us.